and welcome to Masking for It, the podcast with a purpose, combining clinical insight with lived experience. Join us as we explore the realities of high-masking neurodivergent adults, debunk myths around autism and ADHD, and challenge outdated and harmful systems as we discuss the ways we can help neurodivergent people not just survive, but thrive. We're here so that the hidden can feel seen, the confused can find clarity, and the future can be different, because it needs to be. You can help us massively by following or subscribing, and in return, we can continue to bring you along behind the scenes with expert guests, pioneering research, and the chance to say you were a part of the change that we're creating. So, let's do this.
Being stuck between a rock and a hard place of needing something and that's what you've got, but is it ideal? Not necessarily.
No.
But it's what we've got to work with now, and hopefully we can keep looking at what alternatives are coming around and how we can change it moving forward.
Yeah, and I think we always try and approach that with honesty with people, that we acknowledge the fact that the ADOS will be uncomfortable, that it will be a bit weird, and that's the way it is, and that I hope helps people to see that, you know, we're using this as part of the process, but we're not doing this on purpose to trick people or to catch people out. It's just a tool that kind of achieves the goal that we want it to.
What you're saying has reminded me, it did feel really weird. Some of the tasks, and I obviously won't go into them too much, but felt like they wouldn't be weird if you were being assessed as a child. They felt weird to do as an adult. And that's what potentially I felt made me act differently, because I suddenly felt really self-conscious, because I was suddenly like, oh, this is odd, as you say.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, don't we, Gail?
Yeah.
And people will say it's very, very infantilizing, a bit patronizing, perhaps.
And is
to
that
do
because
some
it
of the
was
things
designed
that
at the
actually-
same? Sorry, is that because it was designed at the same time as infantile autism was the thing? It hasn't caught up, or when does it sort of cross over in the timeline? Do you know?
I think it is a bit of a hangover from seeing autism as a childhood disorder. But it is very much set up for adults and older adolescents. So the childlike stuff is actually geared towards, allegedly, from, kind of high school onwards. So
Right.
I tend to try and gauge because there's different modules of the ADOS, which is like the snapshot of how someone communicates. That's what the ADOS is. It's an observation scale. And it's about, it lasts about an hour. And the idea is that you set up the novel activities and conversations that someone hasn't had an opportunity to practice. So a lot of them involve playful type activities or pretending that you just wouldn't ask an adult to do unless they were in a drama school or something. And it just feel a bit like a hangover from the way it used to be, in terms of the children being the focus of it. But I suppose there's got to be some way of observing someone. And my feeling is that if you sit and talk to someone for long enough, you can observe all of those things without doing an ADOS. But as Gail said, you've got to be using formal assessments to be valid or to be accepted as having done an appropriate assessment. So, there's a lot of discussion on social media, perhaps even in professional circles, where people say, well, if you go for an independent assessment, you just paid for a diagnosis, which may be the case, occasionally, but generally people who are working in the independent assessment sector probably have worked in the NHS, they've been trained through the NHS for sure, and they're working in independent practice still using the same tools, or they should be, and they should be using them properly. And I think one of the things that's happened with COVID is that some of these tools are being used remotely, which is not what they were intended for at all. So that's another added weirdness about it. I don't know how you could do an ADOS remotely, to be honest. some of the activities that, trying to elicit some of those observations of behaviours that you're looking for. You can't do that online. That's a whole other rant. But I suppose it's that you've got to have observed somebody in a way that hopefully gets you to be able to see a range of different behaviours, overt behaviours. And the only tool we have for that is the ADOS. So we're stuck with it, really. And, it is helpful in lots of ways, but also you're not the only person for sure who says that felt weird. And I think it bothers me that at the end of an autism assessment, someone's made to feel weird when it's not them. It's the assessment tool. That makes me feel deeply uncomfortable because it's not okay.
I think what it brought up for me, and this is just a very personal thing and no comments on the assessment itself, is those things, those particular tasks. I felt quite sad because they're something I was really good at and spent my entire childhood quite obsessively doing, probably, that sort of play. But by the time I was 26, I mean, to think drama used to be my subject. I used to do 5%, used to love it, and do really well in it. And there came a time when things were getting really, really hard. And I went into survival mode rather than being able to be me. In the final years of school, I lost those abilities and became extremely repressed. And it's honestly baffling to me, but probably makes tons of psychological sense. I can't really do accents anymore. I lost that ability. It's like my brain literally went, right, this isn't helpful right now. Just pass that out. But that to me was something I really enjoyed and loved. And I just stopped having a freedom about me and being able to play and be free and feel uninhibited because I'd been so deeply criticized and was being traumatized essentially, and just became completely inhibited, just put the hatches down. And so I think just sort of probably on a personal note more than anything, that's what was hard about that activity for me. But I wonder if actually that's probably quite a common thing and maybe a sign in itself. I don't know, but
yeah,
it's just interesting.
And I think a lot of people ask that question: how do you tell trauma and autism apart? And I think when Gail and I were teaching on the clinical psychology training course, that was a really common question. What is trauma and what is social communication differences? And I think it's really rare for someone to be neurodivergent and not have had trauma as a result of that. And it's really difficult to pull it apart. But there are specific things that we look for that are not trauma, that are very specifically autistic. So I wonder whether it's worth us going through just some of those things that we might look at and say, well, it's not necessarily a disorder, but it is a thing that autistic people do that is in the list on the diagnostic.
I think that would be really helpful to give people some clarity around some of those things, because I think it is very confusing and hard to know.
Well, I've got another list here.
I'm fine with the list today.
I am on. I've got a lot of lists in the book. But I think it's... So if we think about the 2013 DSM, which is what we were talking about before, which is now covered in dog dribble. Yeah, so we're looking for like a set pattern of behaviours, and you don't have to have every single thing, but you're looking at them existing in a pattern. And so when you look at the DSM-5 for anything, there's kind of a list of criteria that you need to meet to be able to be diagnosed with that particular thing. So for autism, you've got to have something different about your social, emotional reciprocity. So that might be about conversation, turn taking, that kind of thing, that reciprocity in interactions. Something about a difference in your non-verbal communication alongside that. So, it might be about facial expression, gesture, eye contact. It doesn't have to be eye contact, which is what everyone's obsessed with. It can be, but there are other things.
Well, did we speak about the eye contact just quickly because I think that is something that people really latch on to. So obviously the stereotype is that autistic people can't give eye contact. And what gets said to me most often is, but you do eye contact, you can give eye contact. Yes, actually, in my assessment, I remember in the notes, it says that I give too much eye contact. And for me, when I hear about eye contact and why people can't look at the time, and I think this is something I do whilst we record as well, is I look away a lot whilst I'm speaking because I'm thinking, and eye contact would distract me from thinking because I'd be focusing on that. However, when I'm listening, I really want eye contact because to me, that's how I'm reading. I'm sensing a lot. I think you've spoken, and we can speak more about it another time, is I will read people by sensing and an energy, and that does need more explaining because it's not hocus pocus. But certainly when I'm looking at eye contact, it's about what is going with the words, and it's helping me take it in, because I think I register things more by their meaning and intentions and the conversation. That's how I remember, other than just taking it in, because I'm actually not great. My auditory processing's a bit off, and I think that's the ADHD and the working memory. So it's really important to me to have eye contact when someone's speaking to me, to understand their state and understand the meanings behind their words, but that also helps me retain it and interpret it, which then it stays there. However, lots of people are the exact opposite of that, aren't they? And they will be doodling, and teachers will be annoyed, thinking, well, you're not listening to me. I need eye contact so I know you're listening. But then they can't retain it because, like, when I'm thinking, I have to look away because then I can pay attention. They have to look away to pay attention to what's being said. So
And I think that's why it's so important that when you're doing an assessment, you're observing what's happening, but you're also asking the question as well. Like, what is eye contact like for you? Like, what is your experience of eye contact? Because it's not a binary thing, is it? It's not either absent or present. The subtleties in eye contact and how it's used, and the feelings that are associated with making eye contact, and how that impacts on attention and processing and everything else, that is really important to understand, because otherwise you don't get the full picture. You know, how much work somebody has to put into making eye contact, for example. So if we're observing in the ADOS that somebody's making eye contact, we don't know what's going on to enable that to happen. And so we need to find out that from the person alongside that.
What's your observation, Lesley, in general when it comes to eye contact?
I think a lot of people describe looking past someone or looking here. So it looks like they've kind of perfected looking at someone's eyes when they're actually not. Yeah, or they might be looking sort of just below someone's chin. So people describe learning to present as if they are, because that's obviously very, very important to neurotypical people, to give eye contact. And so it's...
So they try and appease people, and they are making an effort to engage, rather than it's something that's just being ignored.
Yeah, and I think this is something, especially now in high schools, in secondary schools, that the direction is that you track the teacher at all times during a lesson. So the expectation in education is that you're showing that you're listening through making eye contact, through visually tracking somebody, because they want to see those overt signs of listening and attention, without perhaps understanding that nuance of, well, if I am making eye contact or I am tracking you, then actually I'm not able to attend fully to what you're saying, because the majority of my energy is being put into watching you and not listening and processing what you're saying.
And how long has that been implemented as a thing? Because that wasn't when I was at school.
Yeah, it's definite. I would definitely say in the last 3 to 5 years, probably, that, and it's increasingly see those kinds of directions in school, particularly secondary schools, I think.
So that's very strange, given that we should know more about that now. So there's definitely some miscommunication going on, or just a gap in communication. It's not happening about.
Yeah.
This isn't probably good practice in a classroom.
Yes. Yeah. And I think then it makes a big thing of people that then need an adjustment to that. And I suppose it's a really good illustration of actually that rule isn't helpful to everybody. It doesn't achieve what you want it to achieve. What you want it to achieve is students listening to you and processing and being able to take on board what you're saying. That's the ultimate goal. You've chosen a very specific way of students demonstrating that, but that isn't, it doesn't achieve the goal for everybody in that lesson. And actually you don't need to see overt signs of listening to be able to know that students have received the information that you've given them. There's different ways of establishing that. And that maybe that takes a little bit more time, or you have to do that in a slightly different way. But surely that's part of the way of teaching anyway, that you question students about what you've been saying, or they complete work based on what you've been teaching them. And that gives you an indication that they've processed the information. But that immediate non-verbal signal from a student could be just totally misleading. You don't know what's happening behind the eyes, do you? The only way of doing that is if they communicate around it.
So we can definitely pick up on that as something that translates to, needing to relay that to schools. That would be something we'd register as something we need to be communicating on our mission. What else is there, Lesley? Sorry, I know I interjected. I just know that that's a big one for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think, my phone overheated and just threw me, because I was on, but that's why I got thrown off. So hopefully it wasn't that the ether was going, oh my God, will you shut up and turn me off? It was my phone. But I think that's probably another good analogy, is my phone was working so hard that it actually overheated and went off. And I think that's sometimes what happens for autistic people, who doing all the things that you're supposed to do, like giving eye contact, and it just comes at a cost. But people can do it because we're conditioned to think we have to do it. And I can understand if a teacher's really frustrated with the student's behaviour and it comes across that they're being belligerent, then it just, everybody's heightened emotionally with that situation, that interaction that's going on between two people or a group of people that might be, constantly disrupting the lesson. And if you've got someone who appears to be being belligerent by not looking at you or looking away or doodling, it can appear belligerent when actually sometimes it's just a way of managing to stay connected, but just losing that obvious overt sign of it. So like things might drop off. If you're trying really hard to focus, other things might drop off. But you've received the information. So I think it's like what has to give for you to be able to give eye contact? Probably processing of the information. But if you're doodling and not looking, maybe the processing is happening. So it's almost like things are a payoff. And obviously my phone being the hotspot for the past 2 hours has cost him dearly, and he's just overheated and stopped working. I think it's like people expect if the phones to go on forever, don't they? And work all day, and you're on videos or you're on apps or looking at stuff. And at some point the phone just goes, no, I can't do anymore, and either overheats or just dies. And I use that analogy a lot with neurodivergent people and talk about energy accounting and what does something cost. So you might be giving eye contact amazingly, but if you don't ask what it costs or what it feels like, then you've missed the point, because it might cost a lot to do. So yeah, that's the second area, is that non-verbals very often are the bit that drop off.
Interesting. Okay, so that's how nonverbal works as well, is there isn't the capacity for that, as there isn't the capacity for eye contact at some points, because it's just too much at that moment with those demands.
Yeah, for some people it's capacity to speak. And people who are put on the spot find it very difficult maybe to make a decision or to give an opinion or to express themselves as articulately as they can think, because that's the bit that's maybe needing a little bit more energy. So going back to the list, I'm obsessed with lists today. So there's something about reciprocity. There's something about non-verbal communication. And the third thing in part A of the list is about interest, sharing, awareness of other people, taking turns in play, that kind of different elements depending on how old you are. And you've got to have all of those three things, or difference in all of those three areas in a specific way to be able to move on to part B. So they're absolutely, if you don't meet any one of them, then you don't meet criteria. That's the end of it. So they're all about communication and interaction. And then the second part is about restricted interests and behaviours. So there are words in the diagnostic tools we've got that use words like abnormal, derogatory words, again, like peculiar. We don't use peculiar anymore. We've just got different derogatory words. But there's 4 areas in restricted interests and behaviours, and you only need 2 of them. So you don't need all 4. So the 4 areas are around repetitive movements, needing sameness in your environment or in your own head, sensory differences, and interests that are like all-consuming passions, what people might say is obsessional. I prefer to call it passions, talents. That's the kind of repetitive behaviours area. So you've got something around social communication, something about repetitive behaviours and interests and thought processes. And for women, it's very often repetitive ruminations that you cannot see on the outside. So, it can be... So things like repetitively ruminating about what you've said. Could you have said it a different way? Should you have said it that way? What if you'd have said it that way? What if they'd have said that? And getting really, because I think it's perfectly usual, to look back on important conversations and think, oh, could have said that a bit differently. But hey ho, it's gone now, and next time I'll try better. That kind of conversation you might have with yourself. But for someone who's ruminating, it's stuck and it won't go away, and it might be like all day or all night, can't sleep, or it might be like in that situation I repetitively ruminate about something to do with it. What if the fire alarm goes off? What if the fire alarm goes off? What if the fire alarm goes off? Because it happened once and it was terrifying. So things like that get stuck in your head and won't go away. And that's not obvious to people. You can't see that. So you might not see anything repetitive about an autistic person on the outside, but in the head, they could be saying, well, this will not go away. And that's why people sometimes get diagnosed with OCD, because it's a kind of general compulsive element to it. But if it exists in the context of autism, it can look very different or feel very different.
So part of that sounds to me as what I know as rejection sensitivity or rejection sensitive dysphoria. Is that linked, or is that a different word for when it manifests in that way about social interactions?
I think that's quite a recently talked about phenomenon. I think obviously it's been around a long time, but I think a lot of neurodivergent people are talking about that now, rejection sensitive dysphoria. And I do absolutely, it relates to everything, but it become very, very ruminative about it. So if you've got an experience of social interactions going wrong, perhaps because you can't use the same non-verbal communication as someone who's neurotypical, or you maybe have friendships that, you can make friends, but it's really difficult to sustain them. You don't know what you're doing wrong. Why is everyone falling out with you all the time? And then your rumination might become linked to something in relation to your social communication difference that's become a problem for you. Very often people questioning, am I good enough? Did I do it right? And if you've got a real sense of perfection, and real high standards for yourself, that can then sort of get trapped within that. Well, if it's not perfect, it must be crap.
Mm. Interesting, that one, because I remember a therapist saying to me once, because I would ruminate quite a lot, and you spoke about that in a completely non-neurodivergent context. This is pre-diagnosis. And they said, oh, is it really horrible to get stuck with those thoughts? And I said, well, it's horrible when they feel negative, but sometimes it's also sort of, I like to sit and ruminate, if that makes any sense, because I guess you're kind of processing, it's helping you process and work out how you feel about it, whether you need to worry about it or not, and any of those things. And they seem completely stumped by that, because obviously it's something that doesn't sound pleasant, and pleasant it isn't, but it's like, maybe it's just because it's familiar as well, because it's something that my brain does. But that probably is an indication of a neurodivergent person, isn't it? That difference between, well, no, it's not just anxiety going on, and it's actually a process that my brain's attuned to, for better or worse. And it goes further than it does for most people. And sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's unhelpful. It's both.
Yeah, and it can be comforting, because it was some therapeutic kind of approaches might be, well, if you go into a situation which you know is tricky, you might affirm something to yourself and say, yes, you can do it. Yes, you can do it. You might try and tell yourself these things in a positive way, like, come on, you did it last time. You just go in there and have that conversation with yourself in your head. It's the kind of intensity of it that perhaps is different. And I think that's one of the things that particularly impacts girls and women being assessed and diagnosed, is that some of the things that girls and women are really passionate about don't look that different on the surface from things that other girls and women might be passionate about. So, it might be someone's really into horses, or a really voracious reader, or, they might collect something like makeup. When you actually say to, like me and Gail did the other day, how much actual makeup have you got? And you're like, whoa, that's a lot of makeup. That's like impressive. It's not a problem. It's just that knowledge of makeup, or that knowledge of the beauty industry, for someone who's 14 might be really unusual, but not a problem. It's their expertise. And I think if we start using words like expertise and passion instead of obsessional and ruminative, then there's a shift in the way that we accept people and the way that they operate. And I think language is so powerful in perpetuating stereotypes. I think we that's another way we can be kind, I think, to people, is when we talk to people who are neurodivergent, or about neurodivergent people, what language are we using in the moment to describe who they are? And we describe, or might reflect to them what they look like or how they come across. The language that we use with people is absolutely something we can control. And it's important to be really, really mindful of checking as well. It might be that a particular word is okay, but if you don't know, it's like any minority group, just check and ask questions. And that's a kindness that we can give to anyone, especially these days when people are so, it's almost like diversity has exploded, and people are starting to talk about how they're different. It's allowed. It's not illegal anymore to be gay, for example. And people are talking a lot about different ways of being. I think one of the things I don't know if you've been watching Big Brother, but how the different generations in Big Brother are talking about different things. It's like, oh my God, you can't say that. But, you suppose you can say what you want, can't you? Free speech, but we've got to be mindful of how we describe it. And I think that's where me and Gail get really frustrated with some of the diagnostic tools, because the words that they're looking for us to use are offensive now.
And if we increase the understanding, then it becomes easier to understand the word and why that's important or why that's applicable. Language is such an important thing for us. And I think the more you're open to learning, it's easier to be kind. I think people often become unkind around things like that just because they don't understand, and it's a fear of something, it's a fear of the unknown sort of situation, so you block it out and dismiss it, rather than, there are still words we need to find for certain things about our experiences. And it's actually listening to Dr. Samantha Hugh, who's incredible, the neuroscience and research she's doing at the moment, but she was likening it to how female symptoms of a heart attack are different to male symptoms of a heart attack. And there's even conversation about, well, do you call it just a different thing then so it can be identified? But then it's like, well, the root of it is the same thing, just as with autism or ADHD, the root is the same thing. Yes, it presents differently. And I just don't even know whether we're hindering ourselves by sticking rigidly to one thing because we're like, but it is this one thing, or whether we do need more language, but then everyone's like, oh my God, there's so many labels for all sorts now. And I think it'll take some time for us to flesh out what the right route is with that. I'm still undecided as an autistic ADHD person. I don't know. And I think even in the community, I remember it's a minefield. About a couple of years ago, there was a really heated conversation about, do you say you have autism or do you say you are autistic? And lots of people felt really strongly that you should never say you have autism because that sounds like a disease, or that sounds like you've contracted something, or it's an accessory like a handbag, something that you have. You are autistic. So it is your identity and it is you. Now, when I was first diagnosed, I actually felt very differently to that, in that I just needed a little bit of distance actually from the diagnosis, because I was still working out what is my neurodivergence and what is me, and trying to marry the two and understand where they came together. But that took time. That was a process that's extremely personal. And to be honest, to this day, probably just as a grammatical thing, I might use them interchangeably. But people in the same community were tearing each other apart over this use of language. And more than anything, I just sat there and I just thought, come on, have we all not been through enough? We're lucky to know who we are. Can we let everybody live as they need to and feel comfortable? That's, isn't that the whole point? So there's a long way to go when even people can't necessarily agree between themselves. And I, as a neurodivergent person, couldn't say one way or the other on whether we need to stick to language that recognizes one condition and one spectrum, but I feel potentially has too much under one umbrella. But then I don't know what the words are, because even the levels thing actually that we mentioned earlier kind of makes total sense. That's trying to put some language to there are differences without saying anybody has high or low support needs, but then it still does, so it's still not quite right. And it's just really hard, and still needs working out.
I suppose it's very situation dependent, isn't it? Because I would say I have a hearing impairment and I've always had it. And it was only like in my 30s that I got hearing aids. And I was like, okay, everyone can hear this much. I didn't actually know, and realised how loud I was talking, and realised that people across the street could hear what I was saying, and that I didn't know that you could do that. So how I didn't get beaten up on a weekly basis, I don't know. Saying things like that, I didn't realise anyone in the street could hear what you're saying. So I wouldn't go, I am Lesley, I am with deafness. So sometimes I say I'm deaf, but I'm not deaf in that anyone needs to support me. But like on the phone, I just can't tolerate being on the phone anymore, and now I just avoid it at all costs. But I don't need support. I just need people to not put that awful screechy music on, because I hear it really distorted in my head. Well, in whatever bits of me do that. And then when people mumble or have the microphone under the chin, so you can't hear what they say, and that doesn't require any support. It just means, and people need to just be a little bit thoughtful about the fact that if you've lost every other way of communicating apart from your ears, at that point it becomes really difficult. So it doesn't help me, and there's no support needed. I don't need people to use the phone for me, and it's not severe enough that I need one of them typing, communicating things. You know what I mean?
Type text.
Yeah, text to talk. Well, you know what I mean? The technology,
Yeah.
but it's kind of it's an irritation that just becomes like a weekly issue. But no, I would never say any support for it. Just annoying, and I suppose it's going back to that kindness thing again, that if people don't necessarily need support with something, it's just really irritating. And if there's an expectation that you do it all the time, then you might be a bit short with someone else on the phone, or you might be short with someone afterwards that is not related to them. It's just related to whatever little situation's going on in that 5 minutes of time. And I think when we look at levels, it's almost like saying everything all the time is exactly the same. Well, that doesn't apply for any neurotypical person. I think it's Joe Wells, the autistic comedian, who talks about levels of neurotypicalness. How normal are you? He like joke. He's got a really good stand-up routine about. Yeah, and it's cleverly done, isn't it? But when it's funny because it's so absurd.
Yeah. There's a massive part of it which is just being present and in the moment and taking time for the person that's in front of you or that you're interacting with, because someone will tell you that if they need something different, or it's making them feel like they can tell you if they need something different. But otherwise, because it's that presumed competence thing, isn't it, as well? And I think that's helpful, because sometimes if help is imposed on you, whether you need it or not, you might have needed it one day when you had less capacity or were more overwhelmed, and then you might not need it another day, and actually it might, on that day be more of a hindrance than a help. And so I think if we can just be open to communicate about these things, and it's not such a dirty topic, and just feel more kindly and normalize it, that's the goal, really. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, and to invite it. If I'm doing anything that's bothering you or that's difficult, please tell me. And I think one of those that's kind of inviting self-advocacy, especially to children. We've gone from that era of children are seen and not heard and mustn't answer back to some would say the opposite problem, where children have a lot to say. And I think, I love being around young people and children and hearing their different perspectives. And I think we've got to invite that so that people can learn to self-advocate, particularly people who are neurodivergent, because it's hard to know sometimes what you want, but it's also really important to say, can you just stop doing that right now? Or could you do that a bit louder or a bit more? Because that's really helpful. So it's not necessarily about complaining or saying, writing your own EHCP. It's just in the moment having respect for that other way of thinking. That's the double empathy problem that we talk a lot more about now, that the onus is on both sides to communicate differently, and to be mindful that communication breakdown comes from both parties who are communicating, not just the neurodivergent one having a problem and needing to be better.
Yeah, and that's something we can instill in kids now. And I think there's lots of things they're better with already at understanding and naturally accepting, because, we're teaching that way. So all we can do is maximise on that. And then that's the start of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and that goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of the stuff we can do that makes a difference. just within our day-to-day lives. We don't have to be able to change the world to make that much difference, because if we do that once a day for someone, that's positive.
That's doable.
That is all for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you come back next time. Please follow or subscribe so that you don't miss a thing. And if you'd like even more of us, you can go over to www.maskingforit.com and find more episodes and blogs on our website, which get into some nitty-gritty detail because we do love that. And you can also get in touch with us if there's something that we haven't covered, or you have any questions or something about your experience that you'd like to share. Then please send that to us via email. It's contact@maskingforit.com, or any of our socials, which are @maskingforitpodcast. We'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much for being here as we bring the conversation out to the real big world to see if we can change it just that little bit. Thank you so much for being a part of it, and we'll see you next time.